Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi asks people to work together to create a new India in the next 5 years. What are major challenges facing a new India? India has surpassed China as the world's fastest growing economy and is forecast to be so for the next 10 years. Will the Indian economy overtake China's? India is the largest democracy in the world. Some say Indian democracy has been undermined because of corrupt politicians and poor governance. But others disagree. Is democracy in India a success or failure? Both China and India are emerging markets with big potential for development. As the border standoff between China and India continues, is a dragon-elephant showdown inevitable? How does India position China, Russia and the United States in its foreign policy? China and India are two fast-growing economies, and both countries are members of the BRICS group of emerging economies. And as their interests extend further regionally and globally, are China and India bound to bump up against each other more frequently? The armies of China and India are still locked in a standoff in the Doklam plateau in the Himalayas. Will a Sino-Indian clash stain the Asian century? How could China and India reduce the trust deficit? What will help dial back tensions between the regional heavyweights? To discuss the issues related to China-India relations and more, I'm pleased to be joined in the first part of our program by Dr. Lu Yang, who is a research fellow at the Institute of the Belt and Road Initiative from Tsinghua University, and Ravish Bhatia, a Yanqing scholar of Peking University, will join us later in the second part. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Yang Ray. Welcome to the studio discussion here, Dr. Lu. A lot of media coverage in India say clearly, look, this current standoff in Doklam, Tibet, Himalayas in other words, will help India reconsider their traditional perceptions about China and the impact of China's rise. The understatement of which means they used to adopt a pretty mild, polite and balanced strategy concerning the implications of China's presence and rise. Today, the military standoff along the border will threaten to change the traditional paradigm by the Indian policymakers and scholars in their examination of China. Do you think this is a game changer, I mean the border clash?
I would say that it is a very important event in Indian-China relations. And I would not say it's a game changer, but definitely it's a turning point. I think we can look at Indian-China relations in different periods. And we had a very good period of friendship in the 1950s, that was Hindi Chini Bye Bye period. And then unfortunately we had these differences on our border, and we had 1962 war. And then we go to a period which we can say that it's a Cold War period of India. And the normalization comes.
When did we normalize the relationship?
The diplomatic relations was established, re-established in 1979, but the normalization process takes actually much longer. So I mean, since at the beginning of 2000s, Indian-China relations has entered a stage of comprehensive development, and now we can always see some fluctuation of the relations, but this time I think it is to some extent it's very different because I think both sides has attached some principles And we have talked about our boundaries. We have so many rounds of border negotiations. We have special representative talks. And we also have achieved something on the border negotiation. We have established confidence building measurements, and this is why this time China has already been very restrained, because it's the Indian side entered a territory which does not belong to India. But we have this kind of communication mechanism so that currently it's still controllable. It haven't escalated to a large-scale military conflict.
But do you believe politicians on both sides have the political will not to have a head-on collision, not to have confrontation ahead of the BRICS summit in Xiamen, your hometown?
I think these should be separated. BRICS summit is a multilateral one, and Doklam standoff is a bilateral one. I think it's not proper to connect it right now between two different. These are two different. And currently, it will be. Of course, a relief for both sides, also for the participants, the member states of the BRICS summits, that if India and China can resolve their border standoff before the BRICS summit. But I think it should be separate. On the multilateral summit meetings, we should talk about mainly multilateral issues.
Thank you so much. You are watching Dialogue with Dr. Lu Yang with Tsinghua University. She's an expert of studies concerning Belt and Road Initiative. Pretty soon after the short break, we'll be joined by Mr. Ravish Bhatia, a intern scholar of Peking University. Stay with us, please. Welcome to our discussion here. You are late. I know the traffic congestion has always been underestimated by the expats here in Beijing, but welcome. A big warm welcome to our program for a balanced discussion about the bilateral relationship, or the so-called geopolitical competition between the dragon and the elephant in Asia, the two giants. Let me go back to the first question.
Yeah.
Do you believe the current Doklam standoff between the two militaries threaten to lead to confrontation between the two biggest economies in Asia?
In the last 40 years, there's not been one instance where bullets have been fired on the India-China border. And I think what the current standoff has done is it has created a sort of a hyperbole, which is feeded in by the belligerent responses that come out from both sides. And then that leads to the idea of a confrontation. But having said that, both India and China have the mechanism which is called the Special Representatives mechanism. And it's a very efficient one. We've been in similar situations in the past, and we've gotten out of them. It took 8 or 9 years to get out of them, but we effectively got out of them because of this mechanism, and the confrontation was limited only to an eye-to-eye interaction and no warlike situation at all.
Last night we were discussing political institutions in India. It's an effort by our program to rediscover India, because the majority of the Chinese don't have a sound knowledge about what is going on, the history of India, for example. Now, Mr. Swamy, a member of parliament, joined our discussion via satellite. He said language of the media is spinning out of control, but language of the politicians is controllable, and they try to remain calm.
Yeah.
Do you agree? And do you think this has created a situation where two leaders from India and China will be able to meet on the sidelines of the BRICS summit in Xiamen in an effort to resolve the dispute peacefully?
Yes, I think there are two voices here, two sets of voices here. One is the set which is in the media, and one is the set which is through diplomatic and official channels. Both sides, from what I know, diplomatically have been talking very artfully. There have been discussions. They haven't shown any productive discussions as of now, but discussions are on way. But yes, given that India is a democracy, voices that come out in the open do ask for politicians and members to comment on them. It might not be the same case in China, but sometimes Indian politicians and members of Indian Parliament and even bureaucrats need to respond. But I feel that they've responded very artfully.
No one questions the glow of democracy, which is compared to universal value. Dr. Lu, with regard to the border issue, do you think policymakers in both countries are likely to be held hostage by the rapid rise of nationalism, and in the case of India, it's a dual enemy of, for example, both the Hindu nationalism and the general nationalism, both threaten to derail peaceful negotiations or finding a peaceful solution. Do you think, first of all, this is a public enemy number one for both sides to find a constructive solution?
I think their disputes can be resolved if we find the correct way.
First of all, how do you estimate the strength of nationalism in China? Do you often read Global Times?
Yes, I read Global Times, but I think there's always voices there. So a very strong voice, nationalist voices, and border itself, it's naturally connected to these very strong nationalist sentiments, and we can also.
Is it blessing or curse for domestic politics at this moment for China?
I think. To some extent, maybe it is to some extent it's create a kind of hype, and nationalism in these cases. Sometimes nationalism, if we only look at the territory through this nationalism, and sometimes it will lead to a position which both sides very difficult to make some compromise.
Perhaps what makes a real difference between South Asia and East Asia is that our strategic orientation actually lies in East Asia. We don't take India as an enemy, but the border dispute somehow has spun out of control because of the widespread use of social media.
Probably.
The video about the standoff was posted, unfortunately, on television channels, and therefore it became a major media event. So, do you think we are held hostage by the age of social media?
To some extent. And interestingly, that video was not even of the same place. It was an old video. And it just leads to tapping on a sense of vulnerabilities that exist on both sides of the border. Because India is vulnerable through the Siliguri corridor, and China is vulnerable in the Chumbi Valley. And so what social media does is it gives a platform to voices that make comments or lead to rise of emotions without complete knowledge of the facts of the case.
Today, the focus of our discussion actually is about the competition between the elephant and the dragon. What do you think, first of all, Ravish, are the major obstacles for the two major economies to come to terms with each other and to address issues of common concern in a constructive manner?
I think the challenge really is first to begin the communication process and to close the trust deficit, because the rise of China and India economically and politically would come with the rise of Asia as a whole. And to have these two countries sparring with each other would not really lead to the growth of Asia to an extent as it would if these two countries participate together. China is increasingly investing in India. Its investments in the last 2 years have almost quadrupled.
Alipayment is said to account for 40% of the
Paytm.
online payment in your country. That's a lot.
That's a lot. And I've been here for a while, and I'm completely enjoying Chinese technologies, which is WeChat and both Alipay. And I think there's so much to learn from both sides. India has a good, in fact, a quite efficient IT system. China has a really efficient manufacturing system in place. So both sides have a lot to learn from each other. And as economies in the West start to slow down, we need to together invest in engines of growth, which can be Asia and Africa as well.
Other obstacles, I'm afraid, include Kashmir, how China perceives what India calls terrorism in the area of Kashmir and Jammu. China refuses to support India to join the nuclear suppliers group. Neither does China willingly support the Indian effort to become a permanent member of the UN Security Council if a serious plan of reforming the United Nations is to be put into practice. But President Trump has made it very clear that Washington is ready to support the Indian. Maybe this is a sweet talk. What do you call it? The sweet coating or whatever?
Sugar coating.
Yeah, sugar coating. His public relations skills by Trump, who wants to sell a lot of arms to India. So, why do you think China is perceived as anti-India by some of the elites in India?
I think because India, it's also a civilization state, and its elites are very proud of its nation, and it is difficult for India to and now in Chinese development, it's very fast. And to some extent, it feels that it takes some time, and China's rise is a kind of threat. And maybe strategically, it's...
well, India is accused by some of the Chinese scholars of being a regional hegemony, a regional hegemon in South Asia. Bringing Nepal, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and then perhaps Myanmar under its security umbrella. There's a formidable Indian presence in all these small and weak neighboring countries, so to speak. And therefore, is it true that it is very difficult for China to penetrate into these areas with our investment? For example, the whims in the policy-making process in Sri Lanka about reconstruction of Hambantota, the deepwater port, really annoyed some of the Chinese. And our construction of a military base in Djibouti was also viewed by Indian elites as a threat to the Indian Ocean, which has somehow been taken as a backyard of India. So there's the accumulative perception on the Chinese side that India wants to control South Asia and perhaps in the Indian Ocean.
It's not only so India have so Chinese have this perception. Indian South Asian neighbors, small neighbors, have these perceptions as well. The things that China's are with the expansion, with the One Belt One Road initiative, and China will definitely have its projects with Chinese South Asian
for example,
neighbors,
the China-Pakistan economic corridor.
Yes,
I'm
because
glad you
they are
mentioned
also
that.
South Asian
I think
neighbors.
before,
Yes,
it's important to mention here that before you go on to the therefore part of the question, it's important to understand if it's right to call India a hegemon, and if India can put the same accusations on China. You mentioned the China-Pakistan economic corridor. It's probably one of the best cases of hegemony in South Asia, if you want to call it. There are 9 SEZs that China is going to come up with in CPEC, and not one of them has any Pakistani companies. Even the head of the State Bank of Pakistan has said that it would be really difficult for Pakistan to get back the loan that Chinese state-owned enterprises and Chinese banks are giving to Pakistan. And that would mean, like what happened in Hambantota, is that China essentially gaining control or military bases or lending out land and ports in Pakistan. So as far as India's relationship with its neighbors is concerned, it's based on a long history. And before India became a constitution, had a constitution and gained independence, there were all these princely states which were very closely connected to each other through culture, as well as through people-to-people interactions.
What do you think of the alleged regional ambition of India?
I mean, I think
Perhaps
Ravish is right, because because you have to stand on your own positions to think about. For Indian, they have their understandings of their positions and their rights in South Asia. But you should think about the South Asian neighbors, what they think of India. So this is something that you say that India have this kind of connections, but whether South Asian countries also perceive that
Taking
it's relative.
Bhutan as an example, Bhutan
Yes.
does not enjoy its independent diplomacy or capability of self-defense. Therefore, Indian troops were deployed there, and a lot of the Chinese were taken aback by the forward military presence of India in Bhutan. They crossed into the territory and into what we call the Chinese territory, and hence the current uproar in our media about the dispute.
Maybe then that begs the question to ask, why does Bhutan not trust China? Bhutan and India has had a military cooperation agreement for a long time, and the Indian military did not go there by its own accord. It was only when the Bhutanese government called on the Indian military that they step into the border. And then it also...
Government voice and position is one thing. What about the voices coming from the grassroots level in Bhutan?
I've been very close.
In the parliament.
Yeah, I've actually worked very close to the Bhutanese
Do you have a consensus there? They united in their position?
I think the Bhutanese government is very united.
When you
and
look
that's
at
the reason.
Facebook, you will have some different voices coming out of
Well,
Bhutan.
you also mentioned that social media is probably not the right way to make the right decisions.
But that's perhaps the most liberal platform for non-Western democratic countries. But having said this, let's look at other issues. Why does India alienate itself from the traditional non-aligned movement? Because New Delhi refused to send a delegation to the non-aligned movement in Venezuela, and that may have sent a very meaningful message to the rest of the world about the image of India, which is one of the 5 founding members of the non-aligned movement. Does it mean dangerously that India will align itself with the United States should the Doklam standoff fails to be resolved peacefully?
So before answering that question, if I may just mention this, India's foreign policy is very independent. It is not based on what country A tells us to do or what country B tells us to do. And as far as the non-alignment movement is concerned, it is very much an Indian dream, and which is exactly where it stems from, the way our foreign policy functions. We don't want the Indians to tell us the Americans to tell us what to do, or Russians to tell us, and therefore, ideologically, it is very much in place. Where the non-aligned movement perhaps lacks is that it needs to get a new raison d'etre. In the changing world, in the changing multipolar world that we have now, nobody is aligning with anybody. Everybody is interacting with everyone. And as far as the Indian delegation is concerned, I think the Prime Minister did not attend, but the Vice President did attend, which is a very senior representation and which goes on to show that India is serious about the members and what they stand for, and that we have very close relationships with all of them.
What do you think of the Indian foreign policy?
I think I agreed with Ravish. I think in India's foreign policy, there's one important thing that we observe is strategic independence. That means, although now currently maybe because of the China factor, that India feels to some extent this kind of strategic containment of feel threat because China have its impact or its influence in South Asia has increased. But I don't think that India will always follow the United States because this strategic independence. And there are lots of discussions in India about these things. Although now Modi's government shows that it's moved towards different direction, towards non-alignment movement. But this kind of thinking, strategic independence and non-aligned, has deep roots in India's foreign policy.
Perhaps this is an emerging
tradition.
hallmark of the Indian foreign policy to maintain strategic ambiguity, leaving a kind of a margin for your free maneuvers, depending on, for example, whether we're going to find a constructive solution to the Doklam standoff. Once shot is to be fired, then quickly India will have to align itself with Japan and the United States. The two countries, I mean Tokyo and Washington, do deliver a security pact to lay the security corner, maintaining stability in Northeast Asia. Having said this, what do you think of the joint military maneuver in Malabar by the three navies? What kind of a message does it deliver?
I think the maneuvers had nothing to do with the Doklam crisis. They happen almost every year, and they happen with not just India, US and Japan, but also with a few other countries. And just going to, in the rare scenario, a bullet was fired. I think India's military is strong enough and it has a strong presence in the area, and it's very efficient in combats in high altitudes because we train at the Himalayas, and it's efficient enough to not have to depend upon the US or Japan. And this is why India's foreign policy is independent of any other country. But having said that, I believe that this is a very, very rare case. I do not think that there's even a slight chance right now that this would convert into an armed conflict, because from both sides there is the understanding that India and China have too much to lose in case
there's no winner for any war.
There's no winner.
The last question, Ravish, is about the prospects of having an economic giant. You are the fastest growing economy.
Yeah.
Most of the Indians are very confident that you will soon become perhaps the second biggest economy. What do you think is the driving force? Very quickly, because we are coming to the end of this discussion.
I think the demographic.
Demographic.
The demographic is probably one of the strongest points. And adjustments in policy, if they support the growing demographic, India has a lot to gain, and India can play the role that China played in the last decade, perhaps.
What about the counter-argument?
Which is,
I mean, the poor infrastructure, the caste system, the very arrogant elites who may be out of touch with the realities. And yes, you do have some advantages, such as English-speaking competitiveness. But what do you think of the uneven social development?
I think, just addressing each of these points one by one, because they're three separate points. The elites are not as far from the ground because it's a democracy and the representatives rise from the ground.
No one questions the issue of representation in your political institutions. I'm sorry, time is
The Prime Minister
out.
came from as a tea maker, so he's connected.
Thank you so much for your participation in this dialogue.
Thank you.
I'll see you next time. Until then, goodbye.